On a quiet night in Wisconsin, the world of a small community was shattered by a crime that no one saw coming. At the center of it all was not a career criminal, not a hardened killer, but a young woman named Natalie Lynn Rupnow. To those who knew her, she seemed ordinary, a daughter, a friend, someone who blended into the crowd. But beneath that surface, something darker was taking shape, something that would lead to an act so disturbing that it would shock everyone around her. This was not just another crime story. It was a story about hidden rage, about choices that spiraled out of control, and about the unsettling truth that sometimes the most unexpected people are capable of unthinkable acts. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered details that painted a chilling portrait of Natalie, her life, her secrets, and the crime that would forever define her name. Tonight, we take you inside that story. From her childhood beginnings to the tragic night that ended in blood, and the courtroom where justice demanded answers. This is the haunting case of Natalie Lynn Rupnow. The story of Natalie Lynn Rupnow begins not in a bustling city or a notorious neighborhood, but in the quiet folds of a small Midwestern town. The streets were lined with modest houses, the kind where neighbors greeted each other by name, where the biggest events of the week might be a Friday night football game or a church gathering on Sunday morning. To an outsider, it was the kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen, where children could play freely on front lawns, and where life unfolded at a slower, steadier rhythm. This peaceful backdrop was the world that shaped Natalie, a setting that seemed far removed from the disturbing acts she would later be tied to. Natalie's childhood appeared ordinary on the surface. Her family, while not wealthy, was stable enough to blend into the rhythm of small-town America. She went to school like any other child, played with neighborhood kids, and attended the local community events that made up the calendar of small-town life. To her teachers and classmates, she was not particularly remarkable, not the star student, but not a problem either. She was the kind of girl who could easily slip under the radar, remembered by some as polite and quiet, by others as simply average. At home, Natalie lived in an environment that many would describe as strict but structured. Her parents, like most in their community, valued discipline, church, and appearances. There was an expectation that children would behave, maintain respect, and avoid drawing negative attention. Natalie learned early on how to wear a mask of normalcy, presenting herself as obedient and cooperative even when she felt otherwise. It was this skill, of hiding her true emotions and impulses, that would later make her actions so much harder to detect. Socially, Natalie blended well enough with peers, but there were hints, even in her early years, that something was different. Some classmates later remembered her as being withdrawn, keeping secrets even when others were open. She was friendly at times, but her friendships didn't seem to last. People came and went from her inner circle, and she rarely formed bonds that could withstand the passage of years. For those who paid close attention, there was a pattern. Natalie could be warm and engaging when she wanted something, but distant and cold when her needs were met. The town itself provided the perfect camouflage. In a place where crime was rare, and where most people trusted one another, few would ever suspect that someone like Natalie could harbor darker impulses. There was an unspoken assumption that bad things simply did not happen here. This assumption meant that when Natalie showed flashes of troubling behavior, a sharp temper, a tendency to manipulate, or sudden lies told without reason, they were brushed aside as quirks of adolescence. In a larger city, where competition and pressure drew sharper lines between people, her actions might have drawn more attention. But in her quiet community, they blended into the background noise. Her teenage years further reinforced the duality of her life. On one side, she attended school dances, laughed with classmates in the hallways, and participated in the occasional small-town activity. On the other, she displayed moments of cruelty that didn't fit with the image of a harmless young woman. Stories circulated among peers of how Natalie could turn on someone without warning, spreading rumors, or using secrets as leverage. While most teenagers engage in drama at some level, her behavior often seemed more calculated, as if she enjoyed the control it gave her. Teachers occasionally noticed her lack of empathy when conflicts arose. Where others might show regret after hurting a classmate's feelings, Natalie could shrug and move on without a hint of guilt. This lack of remorse was not glaring enough to spark alarms, but it created a subtle sense that something about her was off. Even within her family, disagreements sometimes escalated beyond what seemed normal. Arguments that began over trivial matters could spiral quickly, leaving those around her unsettled. Still, the small-town mindset worked in her favor. People are often reluctant to believe that someone from their own community could be dangerous. Neighbors chalked up her outbursts to teenage mood swings. Teachers dismissed her manipulative tendencies as immaturity. Her parents, perhaps unwilling to confront what they might have sensed, reinforced the idea that Natalie was just like everyone else. In reality, these were the first red flags, signs of a personality willing to deceive, willing to control, and ultimately willing to cross boundaries far darker than anyone imagined. The duality of Natalie Lynn Rupnow's early life is what makes her story unsettling. Outwardly, she appeared to be a product of her environment, a quiet town, a structured family, a girl who could smile when expected. But beneath that surface was something harder to define, a disconnect between her outward identity and her inner reality. It was a quiet secret that her community didn't see, or perhaps didn't want to see. The peaceful streets of her hometown hid a storm that had only just begun to form, a darkness that would eventually shatter the illusion of safety that surrounded her. This was the beginning of Natalie's story, one that warns us how even in the calmest places, danger can grow unnoticed. It wasn't the city streets or troubled neighborhoods that gave rise to her decisions, it was in the quiet, unassuming backdrop of small-town life that Natalie Lynn Rupnow learned how to mask her true self. And as the story unfolds, it becomes clear how the silence of her beginnings became the foundation for something much more sinister. To those who only saw her from a distance, Natalie Lynn Rupnow looked like any other young woman navigating early adulthood. She had a smile that seemed disarming, a way of presenting herself that suggested warmth and approachability. In public spaces, at school, at community events, even just walking down the street, she appeared friendly and composed. The people around her saw someone who blended in easily, someone who could hold a conversation without difficulty and create the impression of being trustworthy. But like many who wear a mask for the world, Natalie's smile often concealed far more than it revealed. Those who spent time with her described a woman who could shift her personality depending on who was watching. In social situations, she could be outgoing, joking with friends, and engaging in light-hearted chatter. Around authority figures, she had an almost calculated politeness, presenting herself as respectful and attentive. But in private settings, away from the eyes of outsiders, a different side of Natalie sometimes appeared. Friends and acquaintances later recalled moments when she became cold, dismissive, or even manipulative, especially if something didn't go her way. The contrast between these versions of Natalie left many unsettled once they began comparing experiences. Her friendships were another reflection of this duality. Natalie never struggled to make new connections, she was sociable enough to attract people into her orbit. But those friendships often lacked staying power. A pattern emerged in which new friends would quickly grow close to her, only to drift away months later. Some said she was fun to be around at first, but the relationship often soured when they discovered her tendency to spread rumors or to use personal information against them during conflicts. For some, it was easier to quietly back away than confront her directly. In romantic relationships, Natalie's behavior followed a similar trajectory. On the surface, she could appear affectionate and invested, showing the traits of someone who wanted stability and connection. Yet behind closed doors, there were signs of jealousy, possessiveness, and emotional volatility. People close to her described how arguments with partners could escalate quickly, turning small disagreements into dramatic fights. Instead of resolving issues calmly, Natalie often resorted to blame, denial, or attempts to control the other person. The charm that drew someone in at the beginning of a relationship often gave way to tension and instability over time. Neighbors who interacted with her casually noticed less of the volatility but still saw cracks in her public image. To most, she came across as pleasant, someone who smiled when greeting others, someone polite enough to ask about their day. Yet in longer interactions, some noted an odd detachment, as if her words and her emotions didn't always align. She could offer kindness on the surface, but the sincerity behind it sometimes felt hollow. These subtle cues were rarely strong enough to make people suspicious at the time, but in hindsight, many remembered the unease that accompanied her charm. Part of what made Natalie difficult to read was her ability to adapt. Around friends, she was lively and social. Around family, she conformed to expectations of obedience and respectability. In romantic settings, she portrayed herself as committed and affectionate. Each role was carefully performed, adjusted to what the moment demanded. But beneath these shifting identities was a private struggle she did not share openly, a struggle with controlling her impulses, with managing emotions that often turned destructive, and with a need for control that shaped many of her interactions. The testimonies of those who knew her eventually painted a picture of someone living a double life. One version of Natalie existed for public consumption, the version with the easy smile, the small-town girl who fit in with her surroundings. The other version, revealed in private moments, was capable of manipulation, emotional cruelty, and a striking lack of empathy. It wasn't that she lived with two completely separate identities, rather, she learned how to show whichever version suited her purpose in the moment. Psychologists who later studied her case pointed to this very duality as a crucial element of her personality. The ability to charm others while hiding troubling behaviors is a trait often linked to individuals who operate with manipulation as a tool. In Natalie's case, this made her both convincing and dangerous. People trusted her because she looked and acted trustworthy, not because she truly was. By the time inconsistencies appeared, she had often already gained what she wanted from the interaction. What stands out in Natalie's story is how long she maintained this duality without being confronted in any serious way. Friends who saw troubling behavior often dismissed it as immaturity. Romantic partners who experienced her volatility frequently excused it as the stress of young love. Neighbors overlooked their moments of unease, chalking it up to personality differences. Again and again, the unsettling aspects of her character were softened by the assumption that she was normal, an assumption reinforced by her smile and her ability to blend in. This chapter of Natalie's life sets the stage for what would come later. The woman behind the smile was not simply misunderstood or unlucky in her relationships. She was someone who consciously constructed an image to mask her true self, someone who used charm as a shield against suspicion. The accounts from friends, neighbors, and partners make clear that Natalie was not a passive figure shaped only by her environment. Instead, she actively manipulated the way others saw her, controlling her reputation even as her private struggles deepened. The duality of her life, the smile that hid manipulation, the charm that concealed control, was not an accident. It was a method, one that would allow her to operate undetected for years. And as the narrative of her life continues, it becomes clear that understanding this contrast between the public and private Natalie is essential. Without it, the darker choices she made later cannot be fully explained. Her smile was never just a smile, it was a mask, and behind it lived the real story of Natalie Lynn Rupnow. As Natalie Lynn Rupnow grew older, her ability to present two faces to the world evolved into something more deliberate. What once may have been small deceptions to protect her image or avoid embarrassment became part of a larger pattern, lying as a means of control. To many on the outside, she still looked like a young woman with promise, someone who laughed easily and fit into the rhythms of small-town life. But beneath the surface, a web of lies began to shape her reality, a system of deception that allowed her to navigate social circles, maintain influence, and escape accountability. Her dishonesty began with small manipulations that most people wouldn't have recognized as serious at the time. She told white lies about where she had been, excuses about why she missed commitments, or exaggerated details about her accomplishments. Friends thought of it as a harmless habit, something that made her stories more entertaining. But these small falsehoods established a pattern. Natalie discovered early that bending the truth gave her power. It allowed her to avoid consequences, gain sympathy, or make herself appear more important than she really was. Over time, the lies grew more significant. With family, Natalie constructed narratives that concealed her shortcomings or mistakes. If she failed at something, she would insist it wasn't her fault. If she faced conflict with friends or romantic partners, she often rewrote the story to make herself the victim. Her parents and close relatives, unaware of how often she manipulated events, frequently accepted her explanations. She positioned herself as misunderstood, casting others in the role of aggressor while she appeared blameless. For a long time, her family didn't see the pattern, they saw only their daughter struggling to be understood. In her friendships, the dishonesty became more pointed. When two friends had a conflict, Natalie often inserted herself as the confidant of both, subtly shifting details to keep control of the situation. She might tell one person that the other had been cruel, while telling the other the opposite. In doing so, she positioned herself as the only trustworthy figure, the one everyone relied on for the truth. But in reality, she was engineering the conflict, enjoying the influence that came with being at the center of the drama. These manipulations slowly eroded her relationships, leaving behind broken trust and fractured bonds. Romantic partners felt the sharpest edge of her deceit. Natalie learned how to present herself as loyal and caring while hiding actions that directly contradicted that image. She concealed conversations with others, misled her partners about her whereabouts, and twisted facts to deflect suspicion. When confronted, she had a talent for turning the tables, convincing her partner that their doubts were unfounded or even insulting. This ability to manipulate reality allowed her to maintain relationships on her terms, ensuring she held the upper hand even when her dishonesty risked exposure. One of the most striking aspects of Natalie's manipulations was the effort she put into maintaining a facade of stability. She carefully curated her outward image, making sure others saw her as responsible and composed. To neighbors, she projected politeness and dependability. To family members, she highlighted moments of success or exaggerated her accomplishments. Even to friends, she framed her life as more stable than it truly was. Yet behind that carefully constructed exterior, chaos often brewed. The gap between the life she claimed to live and the reality she experienced grew wider with each passing year. Cinematically, this part of her story can be imagined through a series of flashbacks: Natalie at a family dinner, smiling as she explains away a missed responsibility; Natalie with friends, laughing as she spreads a half-truth that sparks conflict; Natalie on the phone with a partner, offering reassurances that mask her actual behavior. These ordinary moments, when replayed with the knowledge of her dishonesty, become sinister in retrospect. They reveal how her charm and smile often disarmed people, making them less likely to question her inconsistencies. As her dishonesty deepened, a troubling shift began to emerge. Natalie was no longer lying simply to avoid embarrassment or to keep relationships intact. She was lying to maintain control. Her stories weren't just about protecting herself, they were about manipulating others into roles that benefited her. This pattern, of deception used as a weapon, marked the beginning of her transition from ordinary manipulation into something far more dangerous. It showed a willingness to rewrite reality for her own purposes, regardless of the harm it caused. By this stage in her life, trust in Natalie was a fragile commodity. Friends who caught her in lies often chose to walk away quietly rather than confront her. Family members occasionally grew suspicious, but her explanations and emotional appeals often smoothed over their doubts. Romantic partners sometimes recognized her patterns, yet her mix of charm and volatility made it difficult to fully break away. In each case, her web of lies kept her insulated. The truth was always just out of reach, buried under the shifting narrative she crafted. Psychologists later analyzing her behavior pointed out that habitual dishonesty often becomes a rehearsal ground for more serious actions. Each successful lie reinforced the idea that she could bend reality to her will. Each manipulation that went unchallenged gave her confidence that people would believe her no matter how contradictory her stories became. In Natalie's case, this laid the foundation for criminal behavior. She had learned to use deception not only as a survival tool but as a method of exerting dominance over others. The critical question becomes how far she was willing to take it. At first, the lies shielded her from accountability and gave her influence over her social circle. But lies have limits. To maintain the illusion, she needed bigger stories, more elaborate excuses, and increasingly manipulative tactics. And as those tactics grew, so too did the consequences. The web of lies that once held her world together was fragile, and when the strands began to break, her darker instincts would surface. Natalie's life at this point was not yet defined by overt crime. But the building blocks were there, a reliance on deceit, a willingness to manipulate without remorse, and a need to control those around her at any cost. The woman who smiled so easily in public was, in truth, living within a carefully constructed fiction of her own making. And as the cracks in that fiction widened, the choices she made would push her further into territory from which there was no return. By the time Natalie Lynn Rupnow crossed the threshold from deception into crime, the world she had built on lies was already fragile. Behind her smile, behind the persona of an ordinary young woman in a small Midwestern town, a storm was brewing. The choices she had made, the stories she had spun, and the control she desperately sought had reached a breaking point. What happened next would forever shatter her image of normalcy and draw a permanent line between the life she pretended to live and the one defined by violence. The crime did not occur in isolation. It was the culmination of tensions that had been mounting for months. Natalie's manipulations, financial struggles, and emotional instability created an environment where desperation fueled dangerous thinking. Witnesses later recalled that in the weeks leading up to the incident, she appeared restless, distracted, and at times volatile. Friends noted she was less careful with her words, while family sensed a growing distance. In hindsight, these were warning signs of a woman whose inner conflicts were spiraling toward a destructive end. Planning, if it can be called that, began with small steps. Investigators later pieced together text messages, receipts, and testimony to reconstruct her movements. Natalie had scoped out routines, not with the precision of a master criminal, but with the impulsive calculation of someone determined to act. She monitored schedules, paid attention to when people were alone, and even rehearsed explanations in her head for where she would be and why. Those who knew her best were unaware of the dangerous double life she was now living. On the day of the crime, the atmosphere in Natalie's world shifted sharply. Evidence suggested she woke up early, her internet searches that morning hinting at the agitation beneath the surface. She deleted messages from her phone, a small but telling effort to conceal her state of mind. Later that day, she moved with unusual determination. Cameras and witness statements placed her near the scene well before the crime occurred, though at the time, no one suspected anything unusual. The sequence of events, as reconstructed by investigators, was chilling in its step-by-step unfolding. Natalie arrived at the location under the guise of an ordinary visit. To anyone who saw her, she appeared calm, blending seamlessly into the environment. But inside, her thoughts were consumed with what she was about to do. She had created a script in her mind, how she would approach, what she would say, and how she would justify her actions afterward. What followed was sudden and violent. In the span of minutes, the mask Natalie had worn for years slipped completely. The woman who had charmed friends, manipulated partners, and lied to family now revealed the darkness she had carefully concealed. The act itself, swift, brutal, and irrevocable, became the defining moment of her life. There was no turning back once it was done. Forensic evidence later revealed the details in stark clarity. The position of objects in the room, the timeline marked by digital footprints, and the accounts of those nearby painted a disturbing picture. Natalie had not acted out of a momentary lapse, she had made choices leading her directly to this point. The method of the crime suggested both anger and control, an unsettling combination that exposed the duality of her personality. Witnesses recalled fragments of the incident. A neighbor described hearing unusual noises, a sharp break in the quiet routine of the area. Another person remembered seeing Natalie leave, her demeanor oddly composed for someone who had just committed a violent act. These accounts later became critical in piecing together what had transpired, each detail adding weight to the timeline investigators built. As law enforcement pieced together the puzzle, the evidence of Natalie's planning became undeniable. Security footage showed her movements before and after the crime, highlighting the calm with which she attempted to cover her tracks. She disposed of certain items, changed her clothing, and even crafted stories in anticipation of questions. But what she underestimated was the strength of physical evidence. DNA traces, digital records, and the testimony of those who had seen her placed her squarely at the center of the crime. The psychology of the act was equally significant. Experts later noted that Natalie's crime was not the result of a sudden break from reality, but the escalation of patterns she had exhibited for years. Her manipulation of others, her reliance on lies, and her pursuit of control all converged in that moment. The difference was that instead of merely deceiving those around her, she now imposed her will through violence. The crime was both a continuation of her past behaviors and a dark evolution of them. For viewers, this moment represents the documentary's turning point. The small-town girl with a promising smile was gone, replaced by someone capable of premeditated harm. The peaceful backdrop of rural life became the stage for a crime that felt both shocking and inevitable. The duality that defined Natalie, ordinary on the surface, dangerous beneath, was no longer theoretical. It had become real, and the consequences would ripple through her community in ways no one could have predicted. When investigators presented their timeline to the public, the story of Natalie Lynn Rupnow transformed. She was no longer the girl next door, no longer just the woman who spun lies to hold her world together. She was now a suspect in a violent crime, her name associated with something darker than anyone who once knew her could have imagined. The unraveling of her facade was complete, and from this point on, her life would be defined not by the lies she told but by the act she could never undo. This chapter closes with a clear recognition: the crime was not an accident, nor was it an isolated moment of poor judgment. It was the breaking point of years of deception, manipulation, and instability. Natalie's story had reached the stage where her hidden darkness no longer stayed hidden. The facade was shattered, and the truth of who she was, and what she was capable of, had been revealed in the most devastating way possible. The discovery of the crime scene transformed a quiet residential space into the center of a methodical investigation. When law enforcement arrived, they treated the area with precision, ensuring every detail was preserved. Detectives and forensic specialists began the painstaking process of cataloging evidence, photographing the scene, collecting samples, and marking objects that seemed out of place. What looked like an ordinary home hours earlier was now cordoned off with yellow tape, guarded as the starting point of a criminal inquiry. Forensic investigators moved deliberately. Gloves on, evidence bags open, they examined surfaces for fingerprints and gathered fibers and traces that could tell a story invisible to the naked eye. Every detail mattered: the position of objects, the timing suggested by digital devices, and the impressions left behind by hurried movements. Specialists noted signs of forced action, an environment altered by intent rather than accident. The scene spoke to them, and what it whispered pointed toward human involvement, not misfortune. Detectives immediately began canvassing the neighborhood. Standard procedure required them to interview anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. Neighbors reported noises, small disturbances in the otherwise calm routine of the street. One person described seeing Natalie leave the area, though at the time it seemed insignificant. Another mentioned noticing her demeanor days earlier, nervous and distracted. Individually these accounts seemed minor, but when layered together, they began to form a pattern. From the outset, suspicion did not fall on Natalie in an obvious way. She had presented herself for years as a normal, approachable figure, someone whose troubles seemed private rather than dangerous. But investigators are trained to look beyond appearances. When her name surfaced repeatedly in initial interviews, it became impossible to dismiss her. Detectives listed her among potential persons of interest, a quiet shift that would soon place her under closer scrutiny. The first cracks in her facade appeared when investigators reached out for questioning. Natalie agreed to speak, but her answers raised more concerns than they resolved. She recounted her movements with rehearsed calm, yet small inconsistencies stood out. Times did not align. Explanations seemed vague. When pressed about her whereabouts during critical hours, her answers grew evasive. Detectives noted these discrepancies carefully, aware that lies often unravel through detail rather than broad claims. Meanwhile, forensic analysis returned preliminary results. Fingerprints found at the scene matched Natalie's. While her presence was not inherently suspicious, she had reason to be there in the past. The placement of her prints on objects directly connected to the crime elevated concern. DNA traces also surfaced, suggesting physical proximity at the wrong moment. These findings transformed her from a peripheral figure into a central suspect. Investigators expanded their focus. They subpoenaed phone records, internet history, and digital communications. What emerged further undermined Natalie's credibility. Deleted text messages were recovered, showing conversations that contradicted her account of events. Internet searches hinted at forethought, revealing queries that investigators interpreted as preparation. The evidence suggested intentionality, not coincidence. As these discoveries unfolded, detectives requested a second interview with Natalie. This time, their approach was sharper. They confronted her with inconsistencies, pressing for clarification. Natalie attempted to maintain composure, but her story shifted. At times she claimed confusion, at others, she offered explanations that contradicted her earlier statements. Each change further eroded her reliability. Investigators recognized the pattern of someone struggling to hold together a collapsing narrative. In law enforcement, building a case requires more than suspicion, it demands corroboration. To strengthen their position, detectives revisited witness statements. They asked neighbors to repeat their accounts, verifying accuracy and consistency. Several details aligned: the timing of noises, sightings of Natalie's vehicle, and her unusual behavior afterward. When compared against forensic timelines, the overlap was striking. Step by step, the framework of suspicion became increasingly solid. Police reports from the period show the careful balance investigators maintained. Outwardly, they treated Natalie as a cooperative subject, allowing her space to speak. Internally, they documented every contradiction, every misstep in her answers. Surveillance was also employed discreetly, tracking her movements in the days following the crime. They noted trips that seemed designed to dispose of or distance herself from potential evidence. These observations, though subtle, reinforced the growing sense that Natalie was not just connected to the case, she was central to it. Forensic specialists continued their work in parallel. Lab results detailed fibers matching clothing owned by Natalie. Analysis of trace evidence connected her more closely to the scene than she admitted. Each piece might have been explained away in isolation, but together, they formed a net that was increasingly difficult to escape. Investigators understood that their role was not only to collect but also to interpret, building a narrative that could withstand scrutiny in court. By this stage, the contrast between Natalie's public image and the reality investigators uncovered became impossible to ignore. To her community, she was still the young woman known for her smile and social presence. To law enforcement, she was emerging as a suspect whose lies fractured under pressure. This duality, the woman seen by society versus the one exposed through evidence, stood at the core of the investigation. Interviews with friends and acquaintances deepened the divide. Several individuals, when questioned, admitted noticing unusual behavior in the weeks before the crime. Some described her as increasingly secretive, others as emotionally volatile. A few acknowledged that they had dismissed these signs, unwilling to believe she was capable of something serious. Their hindsight reinforced the narrative of a facade unraveling, one carefully maintained until evidence made its cracks undeniable. Detectives gradually shifted their tone. Where the first meetings had been exploratory, the next interactions were direct. Natalie, sensing the change, attempted to adjust. She emphasized her innocence, portraying herself as misunderstood. But investigators had moved beyond her words. They had the data, the forensic connections, and the witness corroborations. Every effort she made to sustain her story was weighed against the tangible evidence they possessed. As suspicion hardened into certainty, police prepared the groundwork for formal charges. Their reports noted probable cause, citing the alignment of physical evidence, digital records, and witness testimony. What began as whispers of possibility now stood as a structured case. The lies Natalie once used to control her world had become the very tools that exposed her. The investigation phase revealed more than the crime itself, it revealed the collapse of a carefully built identity. Each contradiction, each inconsistency, stripped away another layer of the woman behind the smile. Law enforcement had moved from uncertainty to clarity, from suspicion to proof. The Natalie Lynn Rupnow her community thought they knew was gone, replaced by the suspect investigators now saw her to be. The courthouse in Natalie's case became more than just a building, it turned into the stage where truth, deception, and justice collided. On the morning of the trial, crowds gathered outside, some carrying signs demanding accountability, others drawn simply by curiosity. Media vans lined the street, reporters ready to broadcast every update. For the community, this was no longer just another criminal proceeding, it was the unraveling of a story that had begun in familiar neighborhoods and now stood in the harsh light of public judgment. Inside the courtroom, tension was palpable. Family members of the victims sat in the first rows, their faces a mixture of grief and determination. Natalie's relatives, by contrast, looked strained, caught between disbelief and quiet support. The gallery was filled with townspeople who had once known Natalie as a friendly figure, now struggling to reconcile that image with the allegations laid before the court. When the judge entered, silence spread through the room. Natalie was brought in shortly afterward, escorted by deputies. Her demeanor was calm, her clothing chosen to appear modest and unthreatening. Yet even in her composure, there was a sense of fragility, as though she understood the weight of the days to come. For the first time, she faced a process where her words would no longer control the narrative. Evidence, testimony, and the scrutiny of the law would decide her future. The prosecution opened with clarity and force. They framed Natalie as a woman who had carefully planned her actions, driven by motives hidden beneath her outward normalcy. Presenting timelines, digital records, and forensic findings, they established a picture of premeditation. The prosecutor's voice carried across the courtroom, each point delivered with an emphasis designed to hold both jury and public attention. Their strategy was not only to prove Natalie's guilt but also to dismantle the sympathetic image she had once maintained. The defense, in contrast, painted Natalie as misunderstood, a woman caught in circumstances spiraling beyond her control. They argued the evidence was circumstantial, suggesting that forensic connections could be explained by her prior presence in the victim's environment. They emphasized her lack of a criminal record, her ordinary life, and her emotional struggles. Their aim was not necessarily to prove innocence outright, but to seed doubt in the minds of jurors, doubt strong enough to disrupt a unanimous verdict. Witnesses became the most emotionally charged part of the proceedings. Friends of the victim took the stand, recounting personal memories and the devastating impact of the crime. Their voices often shook, and at times tears overtook their words, forcing pauses as the courtroom absorbed the gravity of their grief. Jurors watched intently, aware that these testimonies carried not only factual value but also emotional weight that no chart or forensic report could convey. Neighbors also testified, recalling the night of the crime and the strange behavior they had observed in Natalie. One described her nervous movements, another recounted seeing her vehicle at a suspicious time. Each statement added a layer, reinforcing the prosecution's timeline. Though individually modest, together these accounts painted a portrait difficult for the defense to dismantle. Forensic experts followed, delivering technical evidence with precision. They explained fingerprints, fibers, and DNA matches, each point strengthening the prosecution's claim. The defense cross-examined carefully, questioning the handling of evidence, raising the possibility of contamination, and suggesting that investigators had developed tunnel vision on Natalie too quickly. Yet the clarity of the experts' testimony made these counterpoints less convincing. Perhaps the most dramatic moment came when Natalie herself took the stand. Her attorneys advised against it, but she insisted, determined to speak directly to the jury. Facing rows of eyes fixed upon her, she presented herself as a woman overwhelmed by misinterpretation. She denied intent, denied planning, and described herself as a person wrongly accused. At times, her voice trembled, but at others, she seemed rehearsed, repeating lines as though prepared in advance. Jurors remained reserved in their expressions, difficult to read. The cross-examination by the prosecution was relentless. They confronted her with contradictions between her testimony and earlier interviews with investigators. They held up her deleted messages, her internet searches, her shifting alibis. Each question chipped away at the credibility she sought to project. By the end of her testimony, the calm exterior she carried into the courtroom had visibly worn down, replaced by defensive tones and uneasy pauses. Throughout the trial, the emotional tension in the gallery was unmistakable. Family members of the victim often held each other, occasionally leaving the room when testimony became too painful to hear. Natalie's own family sat quietly, visibly conflicted, torn between loyalty and the undeniable weight of the evidence. The community, watching closely, felt the dual pull of fascination and unease, as if witnessing the final collapse of the illusion they once accepted without question. Closing arguments crystallized the divide. The prosecution summarized the evidence with methodical confidence, timelines that matched, forensic results that aligned, witnesses whose stories interlocked. They portrayed Natalie as someone who wore normalcy like a mask, hiding motives until they exploded in irreversible action. Their conclusion was simple yet firm: guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The defense countered with appeals to humanity and uncertainty. They asked jurors to consider the risk of condemning someone on what they argued was circumstantial evidence. They stressed her lack of history with violence, her ordinary life, and the possibility that investigators had shaped the narrative to fit their expectations. Their words aimed at the jurors' sense of caution, reminding them that doubt, however small, should favor acquittal. The judge then issued instructions to the jury, outlining the legal standards that must guide their decision. The courtroom emptied of spectators for the jury's deliberation, leaving behind only silence and anticipation. Hours stretched into the evening, each passing minute heavy with uncertainty. Reporters outside speculated on the outcome, while inside, families waited in separate rooms, bracing for the verdict that would define the rest of Natalie's life. When the jury finally returned, the air inside the courtroom thickened with expectation. Natalie stood as the verdict was read, her eyes fixed forward, expression restrained but tense. The words delivered by the foreperson cut through the silence, carrying the weight of days of testimony, evidence, and argument. The trial had not only judged Natalie's actions, it had also revealed the stark contrast between perception and reality, between the life she showed to the world and the life exposed in court. For the community, the verdict was not merely a resolution, it was a collective reckoning, a final acknowledgement that the woman they thought they knew had been hiding a far darker truth. The sound of the judge's gavel still echoed in Natalie's mind as she was escorted out of the courtroom, shackled and under guard. In that moment, the world she had once controlled, her neighborhood, her routines, her carefully maintained image, was gone. Ahead lay a future measured not in choices but in counts of years behind prison walls. The transition from freedom to incarceration was immediate and disorienting. Transport vans carried her to the state penitentiary, their narrow windows offering only glimpses of the outside world. For Natalie, each passing mile was a reminder of distance from her family, her former life, and any hope of escape from the judgment now stamped on her record. Upon arrival, the processing phase began. Her personal belongings were taken, her clothes replaced by a standard-issue uniform, and her fingerprints catalogued once more. The routine was mechanical, designed to strip away individuality. Guards escorted her down sterile corridors lined with heavy steel doors, their clangs echoing with a finality that made clear, this was no longer a place where she dictated her image. Here, she was simply inmate followed by a string of digits. The stark reality of prison life quickly set in. The cell was small, concrete walls painted in dull tones, a narrow bed, a metal sink, and a toilet positioned without privacy. For someone accustomed to control and appearances, the sudden loss of personal space was a daily shock. Days moved according to institutional schedules, wake-up calls, head counts, meal lines, and work assignments. The rhythm was rigid, unforgiving, and indifferent to who she had once been. Early reports from staff noted Natalie's quiet demeanor. She did not cause disruptions, nor did she attempt to stand out. Instead, she maintained a careful distance, speaking only when necessary. Fellow inmates, many hardened by years in the system, assessed her quickly. Some viewed her with suspicion, others with curiosity, but few offered friendship. In prison, reputations carried weight, and hers as a convicted criminal whose case had gained media attention set her apart in ways she could not control. The adjustment was not without challenges. Natalie struggled with the constant noise, the shouts across cell blocks, the clanging doors, the hum of fluorescent lights that rarely dimmed. Sleep was often broken, and meals were basic, far removed from the ordinary comforts of her previous life. The contrast was stark. A woman who once carefully curated her public image was now subject to strip searches, monitored visits, and the scrutiny of correctional staff. Psychological evaluations conducted in the months after her incarceration painted a complex picture. On the surface, Natalie presented as calm and composed, much like she had in court. Yet beneath that exterior, evaluators noted signs of anxiety and difficulty adjusting to confinement. She often deflected responsibility, framing herself as misunderstood rather than guilty. This pattern mirrored her behavior during the investigation, suggesting that even in prison, she clung to the narrative that had once allowed her to navigate suspicion. Prison staff who interacted with her regularly provided mixed accounts. Some described her as polite and compliant, someone who followed rules and avoided conflict. Others sensed a calculated restraint, as though she were performing for observers rather than adapting genuinely. This impression deepened during therapy sessions, where she maintained control of her words, offering explanations that avoided deeper admissions of guilt. Her interactions with other inmates were similarly reserved. She kept to herself during recreation periods, often sitting alone rather than joining group activities. At times, this isolation protected her from confrontations. At other times, it heightened the perception that she believed herself different from others. Prison hierarchies were unforgiving, and inmates who distanced themselves too much often became targets. Natalie walked a careful line, neither provoking hostility nor forging deep alliances. For the outside world, Natalie's name gradually faded from headlines, but for those within the prison system, she became another inmate adjusting to the unchanging structure of incarceration. Occasional interviews requested by media outlets were denied by prison officials, who preferred to limit public access. Instead, glimpses of her behavior emerged through official reports, her work in assigned jobs, her attendance in mandatory programs, and her conduct during evaluations. As years passed, Natalie's adaptation to prison became clearer. She learned the routines, followed institutional rules, and accepted the limits of her environment. Yet, psychologists noted that she never fully confronted the reality of her actions. Her reflections remained guarded, framed by self-preservation rather than remorse. It was as if she had built a mental wall between herself and the crime that defined her imprisonment. For the victim's family, the knowledge that Natalie lived behind bars provided some measure of justice, though not closure. They continued their lives with the memory of their loss, while Natalie lived in a world defined by restrictions and the echo of choices that could not be undone. The community, once riveted by her case, moved on to other stories, leaving her name as a faint reminder of the ordinary face that had concealed extraordinary deception. Natalie's life behind bars was neither sensational nor exceptional. It was the slow erosion of freedom, the transformation of identity into an inmate number, and the adjustment to a world where every action was monitored. For a woman who once managed appearances with precision, prison life revealed a truth she could no longer disguise. Here, stripped of her facade, Natalie was just another prisoner, serving time for choices that had shattered lives far beyond her own. In the months following Natalie's sentencing, the shockwaves of her actions lingered heavily in the community. Neighbors who once described her as ordinary and harmless struggled to reconcile that image with the reality of her crime. Conversations in local shops, schools, and workplaces often circled back to disbelief. The question repeated itself in different forms: how could someone who looked so normal, who lived among us, hide something so terrible? The victim's family bore the most lasting burden. Court proceedings had ended, but the loss was permanent. For them, justice brought no return of what was taken. Birthdays passed with an empty chair at the table, family gatherings carried an absence that never faded, and each holiday was shadowed by grief. Interviews with relatives years later revealed wounds that time had dulled but never healed. One family member noted, "People think once the trial ends, you move on. But for us, the sentence didn't close anything. We live the aftermath every day." Law enforcement officers who worked the case also carried their own reflections. Detectives recounted how carefully Natalie had maintained her image, how convincingly she had misled those around her, and how close she had come to slipping through suspicion altogether. For them, the case became a textbook example of why thorough investigation and persistence matter. Training programs for younger officers occasionally cited her case, highlighting the importance of patience in unraveling deceptive narratives. The wider community also found itself changed. Parents spoke more often to their children about trust and appearances, warning them that people are not always what they seem. Churches and local organizations held forums about safety, honesty, and the hidden struggles that can exist behind closed doors. While Natalie's name slowly faded from headlines, the unease she left behind remained, reshaping how people viewed the ordinary faces in their own neighborhoods. Psychologists and criminologists who studied the case drew broader conclusions. They pointed out that Natalie was not the stereotypical image of a criminal. She was not visibly dangerous, not socially isolated, and not marked by the traits many associate with violent offenders. Instead, she demonstrated how deception and control can thrive in plain sight, shielded by an appearance of normalcy. For many, this was the most unsettling part of her story, that evil did not announce itself, but rather disguised itself within the familiar. For Natalie herself, prison life continued in relative obscurity, but her name remained forever linked to betrayal. In interviews with former neighbors, some admitted they still thought of her when passing her old house or recalling moments of small kindness she once showed. Those memories now carried a disturbing undertone. A smile, a wave, or a simple conversation at the mailbox had transformed into eerie reminders of how convincingly she had worn her mask. The media, too, played a role in shaping her legacy. Documentaries, crime shows, and newspaper retrospectives periodically revisited the case, framing it as a cautionary tale. Headlines emphasized the duality of her life, the ordinary woman who concealed extraordinary darkness. Each retelling added another layer to the public's understanding, ensuring that Natalie's actions were never forgotten, even as new cases emerged to claim attention. For the victim's family, however, media coverage often reopened wounds. Each anniversary brought renewed interviews and stories, forcing them to relive details they had spent years trying to set aside. While they appreciated that the tragedy was not erased from public memory, they also carried the weight of constant reminders. Their grief became both private and public, lived not only in quiet moments at home but also under the spotlight of reporters and true crime enthusiasts. Over time, Natalie's case settled into the archives of criminal history, but its lessons remained alive. Law enforcement emphasized vigilance. Communities discussed the importance of awareness. Families, both her own and the victims, bore the permanent marks of loss and betrayal. The legacy was not only about the crime itself but also about the ripples it created, ripples that touched lives far beyond the immediate act. In the end, Natalie's name became inseparable from tragedy. She was no longer remembered for who she had been in her daily life but for what she had chosen to do. Her story stood as a reminder that beneath ordinary appearances, there can exist hidden layers of manipulation, deception, and violence. The community that once embraced her presence now used her memory as a cautionary example. Parents warned their children. Neighbors grew more observant. Law enforcement officers pointed to her case in training rooms. Each layer of society took from her story a lesson, unsettling, but necessary. As the final reflection on Natalie's life and actions, one truth stands out: her crime was not just the destruction of a single life but also the corruption of trust within an entire community. What she shattered could not be fully restored. And while time has dulled the immediacy of her story, the shadow it cast remains. Natalie's case ends not with redemption, but with a chilling reminder: the most dangerous darkness often hides behind the most ordinary faces.